Hi, what's up, everyone? Welcome back. Thank you for joining us for another episode of On the Air, the show that's all about getting IT pros and tech vendors together to geek out over technology. As always, I'm your host, Justin Ong. We've got a great show for y'all today. We're going to be talking all about everything you need to know about identity security. So for more on this, we have a Microsoft MVP that's here to kind of chat through us about some of the key concepts that you either aren't familiar with yet and maybe need to learn a little bit more about or add to your existing repertoire. Either way, it should be a great show, so don't go anywhere and stick around. First now, though, we're going to go ahead and introduce our panelists today so you guys can take a look and meet him. Without further ado, let's go ahead and introduce Mr. Nick Cavalancia. Nick, welcome to the show. How's it going today?
Yeah, thank you very much. Glad to be here, Justin.
Absolutely. Nick,
appreciate it.
For those who've not met you before, do you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure. The abbreviated version is 25 years in enterprise IT. I've done everything from owning an enterprise consulting company, an MSP. These days I make my living as a full-time technical evangelist, which means I sort of see myself as like the cliff notes of all of IT. I'm supposed to figure out what's going on in the trends in the industry so that the IT pros in the audience can kind of get an abbreviated version of what I really need to know about this topic, as it were. So
Perfect. Well, we are so glad that you are joining us today, and we're eager to dig in. Let's go ahead and get started. So we're here today to talk about identity security. It's one of the hottest topics in IT today, but also one of the most important. Yep. Can you tell us a little bit about what exactly is identity security?
Sure. I sort of break down identity security into two facets. It's first off, authenticating an individual, knowing that they are who they say they are. And then secondly, making sure that they have the appropriate access to the resources they need from like a productivity standpoint, but then also making sure that they don't have access to the stuff they shouldn't have from a security standpoint. And it's now becoming far more an issue because of the fact that we've got so many separate systems in the cloud that are, of course, they have integration points and so on, but now we've got these disparate systems, disparate platforms, disparate identity stores, and somehow organizations are trying to figure out, how do I make that all work like as if it was my network? Because if you roll the clock back 10, 15 years ago, and it was nothing but on-premises Active Directory, it's a really simple conversation. It's Active Directory, and everything revolves around Active Directory. Boom, we've got a closed system. But now everything is so spread out with different vendors, different services, and so on. Organizations are still trying to figure out, how do I make that work as if it's all just mine?
Now, of course, logins, passwords, even the cloud, these things have been around for a while now. Why do you feel like we're at a moment where this topic is at its peak, seemingly?
Identity is becoming very much of interest to cyber criminals, bad guys, threat actors, whatever term you guys want to use. I know some people hate the term cyber. Stop saying cyber. It's okay. It's whatever. That the idea is that those credentials are becoming very important, and so identity is now moving to the forefront of the security topic, of the security conversation, if you will, because now if we don't get that right, then everything else afterwards is going to falter. Once the bad guy has access, then it's sort of game over, at least within the context of whatever that account has access to.
Let's talk next about two-factor authentication. Can you tell us exactly what that is?
Okay, so just to kind of level set, I'm assuming that some in the audience already know what it is, but for those that don't, we're talking about, normally when you log in, you'll have, let's say, a password. That's a single factor of authentication. It's my way of validating that you're actually Justin. You know the secret password. It's password or whatever it is, right? But two-factor authentication, and then going a little farther than that, multi-factor authentication, we're talking about having additional factors utilized. Most of the audience has probably used even something like, let's say with banking. You logged into your banking app, or maybe online you logged into the banking of your ID and your password, and then they send you a code to your phone, and that's a second factor of authentication. Typically the rule of thumb for two-factor authentication is it's something you know and then something you have. The something you know is the password, and the something you have is your phone, a key fob that's got codes that are generated on it, those kinds of things, a token of some kind. And so that's the general idea. Then multi-factor authentication goes beyond that, where it's not just two factors, it might be 3, 4, 5, depending on the role, the type of access requested, and so on.
So we've heard a lot about two-factor authentication. It seems to be pretty widespread as far as folks recommending that. Do you feel that pretty much all organizations should be adopting some form of two-factor or multi-factor authentication?
So my answer may actually surprise you a little bit, because the answer is yes, but it's not just let's sort of implement it. Let's find the most important people with the most important access that gives us access to all kinds of data that is sensitive, it's valuable outside, that kind of thing. My viewpoint is everyone needs to have two-factor authentication. On the example I typically use is all the way down literally to, let's say, the mailroom clerk, that all they do is log onto a machine and they have access to, let's say, the U.S. Postal Service, UPS, and FedEx's websites and email. That person should still have two-factor authentication as a minimum, because threat actors will still leverage even, let's say, that person's email access and then send out an email to a bunch of people that says, hey, you got a package here that I need you to sign for. It came in today, here's a link to it, to look at the tracking information. And then that link actually leads to something malicious. So it's really easy for them to use that single individual that seemingly has no real value, and in terms of like they have no access to intellectual property or that kind of thing, but they still can be leveraged by a threat actor to facilitate a larger set of access within an organization.
For sure. Now, I have heard you mentioned, in your example with the bank that you log in and it sends you a text message. I've heard actually that SMS-based two-factor authentication in that same method is actually fairly easy for threat actors to spoof. Is that true? And if so, does that mean that we probably shouldn't be using SMS for two-factor authentication?
Depends on what you mean by easy. That's the real answer here. So I've seen everything from, we've heard the stories probably in the news of where, let's say, someone has actually social engineered their way through a cellular company and gotten a SIM swap done. That happens. That's a lot of work for a single time kind of access to someone's phone. So it better be really important. And then I've also seen where two-factor authentication has been done really sneaky. It was a case where someone was trying to gain access to a cloud-based service, and what happened is the bad guys had built a very good spoofed logon page to the point where they wrote some code so that when you provided your ID and password to me, the bad guy, I would go and actually try and send the authentication to the cloud service. And if I got back the thing that said, hey, we need that second factor of authentication, I already have the page that pops up that looks very authentic. Hey, we just sent you a code. What's the code? And then you would type it in from your phone.
Thinking that it's
thinking that it's them. And then they would just pass it on back to the cloud service and they gain access to the cloud service, right? So the idea is they didn't really hack a SIM swap, but they actually facilitated leveraging that second factor of authentication. And then the third example that's sort of more recent is now we're seeing some of the bad guys actually spear phishing cellular companies in an effort to try to gain access and move laterally within the organization, ultimately to find the application that's responsible for doing SIM swaps. And then just, what do you need? Now it's SIM swap as a service. Which one do you need? I have access. They don't even know. I mean, Microsoft says the median number of days that a threat actor is inside of an organization is 146 days before they're detected, right?
It's like half a year.
It is. So it's just about. So you think about. If someone was to have that level of access, that duration of access inside of a cell company, unbeknownst to anybody else, and they're like, what kind of SIM swap do you want? Oh, can you change this? Yeah, it's easy. So it gets kind of scary, and I think that tactic is probably the most scariest, if you will, of all of them, because now they have a long-range access to be able to do SIM swaps.
So do you feel then that we should not be using SMS-based two-factor authentication then?
No, I think the answer is more so you're doing that mixed with maybe some additional factors of authentication and not just relying solely on your phone. Your phone is a reasonably what's the word I want to use? It's a reasonable assumption that only you have access to your phone. But for situations in organizations where, no, we have to absolutely be certain it's Justin, then the answer isn't just the phone, it's something else.
So let's talk about that. What are some other factors then that could be used in 2FA or MFA? And what are some pros and cons of each of them? Okay,
so first off, I'll mention there's a really good sort of document that's been out by NIST, National Institute for Standards and Technology.
Sure.
And it's 800-63B, and that has a bunch of detail around things like what's called authentication assurance levels, which is not exactly what you asked yet, but I will answer your question. And that's about how do you have different levels of assurance that it's actually the person, and then inside of that, they start talking about the different methods. So you certainly have out-of-band devices like your phone. It also sort of acts as what's called a one-time password type of device, where you are getting a single password for this particular session, and then you get a different password next time. The same kind of thing we get with our bank or anything else. You could have cryptographic devices. You can have tokens. You could even use third-party services. I mean, you have Google Auth. There's even companies that are utilizing something that you have. It's sort of meaning like, let's say you have a Gmail account or you have Facebook, and if you've already linked those to your account, then during authentication they can say, great, can you please log into your Facebook account? Because that'd be something else that technically you know, but I think they're sort of looking at it as you have because you have that account and you have access to it or something along those lines. But there's a lot of different ways that it can be done. Just the whole point is it's something that is definitely specific to you.
Okay. All right. I wanted to talk about another element of identity security, which is actually single sign-on, because obviously with all of these different applications and logins and all that sorts of stuff, it can be really cumbersome for users to be able to manage all of those different identities. So single sign-on is something that for sure can make things a lot easier and more convenient for them, but what do we need to know about the security implications of it?
Okay, so good. So you actually touched on both sides, which is really good, because single sign-on, in my estimation, is sort of a twofold benefit to the organization. On the one hand, single sign-on does provide that let's all come to one portal, and it's sort of almost like an app store in some cases, depending on who's implementing it and that sort of thing. It makes it really easy for users and enhances productivity because they're not looking for applications or wondering where they are, or I lost the icon, or whatever the case is. But on the security side, it's more about ensuring that once you are authenticated, then we know that you're you, and depending on the security model in play, we can go ahead and give you access to all of the applications that you need via single sign-on. Or in other cases, it's more of a question of every time you want to access something, I'm still going to validate that you're you, but do it in a way that isn't cumbersome for the user. So it helps centralize the access requests, which means it centralizes the ability for organizations to have visibility and then to authenticate and secure those requests and make sure that it's actually you each and every time as you're going through your day, if you will.
All right. And then so,
Sorry.
That's all right.
As
We're taped.
Yeah, I know.
Okay.
The editor is going to hate me. Sorry, guys.
So you mentioned the cloud earlier. So obviously, does that complicate single sign-on if you've got applications that are hosted by AWS and some that are hosted by Azure and some that are hosted by other SaaS providers? How can we still get the convenience of single sign-on for users in a way that still maintains security across all these disparate platforms?
The initial question is, does it complicate things? The obvious answer would be sort of yes, because now we have all these disparate systems. However, they're all utilizing the same web-based protocols. You have OAuth as an example, and so it facilitates an ability for someone to authenticate from one partner, but then they can say, well, I trust if you say that they're them, then I will give access to that person, even though I'm a totally separate cloud company than you are, kind of a thing. And so it doesn't complicate it from a standpoint of, I think, access, because the integration points are all there, and that's how the cloud's been designed from the ground up. But where it complicates it for IT is ensuring the security along the way to make sure that, for example, just because you did authenticate, let's say, once, in the case of, I think like a really good example is something like in zero trust models, where it's never trust, always verify is usually the standard. And in that case, even though you authenticated, let's say at the beginning of your day at 8:30 when you logged into your machine, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're still you. I still have to validate somehow that you're you when you access some other third-party cloud provider that's different from wherever your identity store is. So it does make it a little more difficult for IT to make sure that it's secure, but from like a productivity standpoint, I don't think it's any more complicated for the user. At least it shouldn't be.
So let's talk about then. So you bring up zero trust and always verify, multi-factor authentication. Each of these is adding a step to the user's day. They not only have to input their password, they have to wait for a text message or check their auth application. How do we be able to enforce these types of policies in a way that doesn't add too much overhead to the users while still maintaining the security?
That's a great question, because it would really stink if it was like, open Window Explorer, please authenticate.
Yeah.
Click on this directory, please authenticate.
Yeah.
Open this file, please authenticate. Oh, that'd be horrible. No one wants to do that. The best security is the one where no one knows about it. It just happens behind the scenes. So in a zero trust model, which is of particular interest in my mind when it comes to cloud-based security, because there are so many systems, so many platforms, and really so much access that someone can potentially have with a single credential, given the single sign-on, the ease of use. If someone just focuses on nothing but productivity to make it easy, then you're giving someone access to 10, 12, 14 different environments in the cloud, if you will. the idea with the zero trust is to have something in place that isn't so much saying, are you you? Are you you? How about now? How about now? How about now? Instead, it's more looking at what you're doing and assessing the level of risk that's involved with that request. So for example, if you want to go over and access, let's say, Salesforce, and it'll check to see, well, is that something that Justin normally does during the day at 3 o'clock? Yes, he does, that's fine. But then you try to go to your SharePoint site, but you happen to be doing that on a Saturday at 7 p.m. And then it goes, well, that's not really normal. And it's not just about the time and the day. It could be what device you're using, what kind of connection do you have for the organization? Are you logically inside the organization, outside the organization? All those kinds of factors, and a multitude of other kinds of factors that can be about IP address you're coming from, what's the reputation of that IP address, all that stuff. Just depending on what's being used to do this, and that is how you measure the risk. And then if something looks out of place, again, the simple example, Justin doesn't normally access his SharePoint site. That's the 7 p.m. on a Saturday. Well, then that might set off a red flag, and then IT gets notified, and someone can either choose to shut you down, investigate, look at it after the fact, whatever it is, that's the right course of action. That's typically how organizations are trying to address this issue.
Got it.
Because of the fact that it's tough to block you over and over and over again when you need to be productive as a user.
For sure, for sure. I want to talk next about passwords. Now, this has always been obviously a key critical part of identity access, but I've been reading that their studies show that that's actually the number one biggest security threat is passwords. And so much so that some folks are really trying to figure out, is there a way that we can kind of move forward into the post-password era and actually become passwordless? Are you hearing anything like this? And what do you know about it?
Yeah, the simple way to kind of break down the buzzword of passwordless is multi-factor authentication. Passwords were the best thing we had if you roll the clock back 25 years or something. That's all we had to figure out who you were. Nowadays, there's so many other options that we can leverage, especially when you look at, even just look at a system where you could have enrollment, and then they ask you a whole bunch of questions or have you linked to different accounts. I mean, there's ways to get all this information to kind of go, help me identify who you are. And that way, when it comes time to actually authenticate you, I can leverage any one of those as is necessary. So it's definitely possible to get passwordless. I think probably the biggest hurdle is getting users over the idea of you don't actually authenticate and them thinking that they're secure. And that typically would be probably the biggest problem maybe in the consumer space, because I have to have a password to log into that system. And if you don't, they're just thinking that they're not secure, whereas maybe in a business environment, it'd be a little easier to explain to a user, we don't use passwords anymore, we're using a token, and we're using biometrics, and therefore we know who you are. It's fine, you don't need a password. So we can get there, it's just a question of, I think, doing it and people feeling comfortable with it.
Cool. Well, Nick, you've given us a ton to think about in terms of, how important identity security is and what are some key factors around it. For those of us who kind of have an existing identity security strategy, what's the best way to kind of audit that, so to speak, so we can understand whether or not our user access solution and policies are sufficient for our needs?
Okay, so I'll break it up into a couple parts. I go back to the very first question when I talked about the authentication side and then the access side, because I think that it's sort of two halves of the conversation. On the identity side, I think it's about looking at the risk of the individual or the role they have or the department they're in, and assessing whether or not the authentication methods being used and the number of factors, whether it's just a password, so it's single factor, or if it's even two-factor with the phone, or if you go beyond that and you start using the biometrics, the one-time password devices, the key fobs with the tokens on them and so on, and you kind of assess and figure out which type of role and which users need which levels. And that goes back to that authentication assurance levels in the NIST publication, because that's actually what it's about. It's establishing different levels of security to verify who someone is, based on how much risk does it really pose if someone was to get in as that person and it not really be them.
Yeah.
So that's the one half. On the other half of the conversation is the access, and to audit that is, unfortunately, I think a lot of heavy lifting in terms of just lots and lots of detail, especially when you look at, okay, you have do you have more than one identity store, and are you just syncing them? Do you have a central identity store? Do you have a a system of record. Usually it's like an HR management system of some kind to make sure that I have everything about Justin in the day. I know your name, your address that you're at, your title, what department you're part of, your phone number's correct, all those kinds of things from a productivity standpoint, but also because they might be used as the basis for, let's say, giving access to something from a security standpoint. You're in the marketing department, I'll give you access to the marketing folder on the SharePoint site or whatever the case is. So it's going through and assessing whether or not you have, in essence, a unified directory, even if it is a mixture of a number of different identity stores and syncing them and so on, but is there a uniformity to it all? And then what security is being given out? Because I think one of the problems is there's so much sprawl with different platforms and different applications in the cloud. The challenge remains for IT to go, well, if I add someone, let's say just something as simple as I'm adding to this group, up in Azure AD. Well, what is the repercussion of that? And if they go, I really don't know, because we have so many different platforms. That's it. So it's really not this magic bullet of just run this report, or it's really doing the work of figuring out what do you have and trying to figure out how do you centralize both the not both, but centralize the management and the granting of permissions throughout all those environments. And that's going to be actually a pretty uphill battle for a lot of organizations, because it's more than likely they just keep piecemealing on new platforms, new applications, and so on, and there's not a lot of thought given to the security aspect, but more to the productivity, like, oh, we need this in order to be able to move forward as a company, but not how do we incorporate that into our security model that we have today.
Sure. Well, Nick, thank you again so much for joining us today. As we start to wrap up, do you have any kind of final advice or next steps that you think our audience should take with them today?
Sure. I'll recap one thing and then kind of introduce one other thing that comes to mind. One is multi-factor authentication for everybody. Even if it's the mailroom clerk just gets two-factor, fine, at least that's better. If someone was to gain access to a credential, then they don't have the second factor of authentication, so it stops them. That's good. Everyone should have that. Then the other part is, think of this in terms of a layered security strategy. The answer is not just to have two-factor authentication. It's having a centralized cloud-based identity store that's based on cloud protocols, that sort of thing. Even Microsoft wants organizations off of on-premises AD and into Azure AD because it's built for the cloud. It's meant that way. So that's important. And at the same time, on top of that, then you have your second-factor authentication, maybe even using single sign-on, and then also some of the traditional things like making sure that there's endpoint protection, and all those things come into play because the cyber criminals are leveraging on-premises traditional devices, they're leveraging cloud-based access, they're leveraging everything they possibly can in order to figure out how to gain access to an organization's data, their systems, information, financials, whatever they can get their hands on. So having some kind of a layered security strategy is definitely going to be part of the answer here.
All right, well, wonderful. Well, Nick, thank you again for joining us. A pleasure as always, and we hope you'll come back and join us again soon.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Well, again, guys, make sure to do your research on identity security and let us know what you guys think are your biggest tips. But until next time, guys, stay safe, and we'll see you guys back here next time. Take care, everybody.